Your hosts are here, Sammie and Michelle. By the end of this podcast, you'll know them well. Adulting, navigating the journey of life. Careers to relationships, pain and strife. Put down the rule book, rethink the status quo. If there's another direction you wanna go, find purpose, passion and mastery in all that you do with Status Post Adulting.
Hey Status Post Adulting fam! This is Sammie
and Michelle,
and you're listening to our Diamond Jubilee episode, aka the 75th episode of Status Post Adulting, where we are going to be talking about the 5 things that Michelle, my co-host, learned in sales. But first, let me check in with her to see how she's doing. How are you doing, Michelle?
I'm good. Wow, Diamond Jubilee. That's like the Queen Elizabeth of episodes.
Yes, I agree. Diamond Jubilee, it's a great episode. False value? That may be true of the diamond, but that is not true of this podcast.
How are you doing, Sammie?
I'm doing good. I've been doing quite a bit of Status Post Adulting stuff.
Ooh.
By hiring or being more open to hiring more individualized help for various things that I'm doing. This past week, in a lot of different aspects of my life, I have been really considering paying for more individualized help. And that's in like various ways. I've looked into getting a therapist. I've looked into getting a spiritual counselor. And I've also been looking into Paula Pant, whose podcast I'm obsessed with. She has a real estate course. And since I'm looking to buy a home very soon, specifically for the ultimate goal of renting it out, I was like, I should take her rental course class. When it comes to those kind of investments, a lot of times they can be quite expensive. And I think at various times in your life, like it may actually not be appropriate to pay that much money for assistance. Like I think if maybe I had just graduated from PA school and I was like, oh, let me sign up for a real estate class, like that's not necessarily a smart idea. But now, I feel like I have my finances under control. I save a large portion of my income and I'm building wealth. I'm on my way to FIRE. I'm getting closer and closer to FIRE. And I think especially when I think about financial independence and retiring early, I really want to be in a good place mentally, spiritually, physically, financially. And I really think it's appropriate to start considering hiring people to like really help me in a very individualized and nuanced way.
I love that, Sammie. I do think there is a rung in the ladder of your financial journey where you do start to see that people are paying for other people to help level them up. I'm always surprised by how many conversations I hear with like popular CEOs or people who are ahead or have started these really big companies, and they pay for a business coach. They pay for someone to help them with their leadership skills or talking skills, therapy, having someone just to talk to about general problems. It is amazing how at a certain point and at a certain level, you can start using a portion of your income to start hiring people who make you better at the things that you value and that you want to improve on.
Exactly, Michelle. And when I was thinking about this, I actually thought back to Dino, my Spanish teacher, who I eventually started doing private lessons with after trying to learn Spanish on my own with things like Duolingo, after taking free classes at the community college and just realizing like that wasn't gonna get me to speak Spanish at the speed that I wanted to learn it at. And I ultimately decided, hey, like it's actually worth me paying somebody to work with me individually to help me progress like exponentially faster than I would either on my own or in the classroom. And it really did. Like now, not only do I speak Spanish, but I speak it fluently and well. And seeing that really inspired me that like, if I hire other people in other aspects of my life within reason, I can potentially grow exponentially in those other realms.
I mean, I think you start to see a return on your investment with certain things. Like in this case, now you have another additional marketable skill. Now it makes you a better provider for your patients who are Spanish speaking. So I agree.
And it gives me more options for retirement, like geo arbitrage to a Spanish speaking country seems completely reasonable because I can actually get along there. I could do jobs where like I could be a telephone translator if I, tested and passed all those testing for those kind of things. So it actually opened up a ton of doors for me, even though at the time I thought I was spending a decent amount of money on each class. I mean, in the end, did I even spend $1 or $2 on that to speak another language? It was so worth it. And I think for some of these things in my head, I'm like, well, I could meditate every day. I know meditation helps me. I could go on a retreat, but I have to take the time off for that. And I kind of realized, to some degree, time is limited and it can be hard to fit that in my schedule. But if I can have like somebody who works with me an hour every once in a while and like is super individualized and super focused on like helping me progress on my issues or whatever I'm trying to learn, one, it's going to be super enjoyable for me because I love learning new things. And two, it will progress me so much faster than other strategies on my own or more passive strategies.
Yeah, the one thing I definitely see a lot, Sammie, when it comes to learning new things and expediting your learning is that there are so many resources out there, but really nothing compares to talking to somebody who's done it before, who's coached people before, who knows what this landscape looks like. Like you can cut so many corners being able to get that individualized help.
So true. I think about my job. People come to me for diet help and they've read all this stuff, but then they go through their diet with me and I'm like, to be honest, if you cut out the smoothie every day that has 56 grams of sugar, you'll probably get rid of your diabetes because like I see that every day. So I'm more familiar with what's the appropriate step.
I totally agree, Sammie. When they say knowledge is power, it's so true. I know that's like a bit cliche, but it is. Like a lot of times there are things that we can't do in our life just because we never learned it. Nobody told us. And sometimes it's hard to figure out what you need to learn because you don't know the right questions to ask or you're completely new to the topic or the idea.
And speaking of learning things and becoming very knowledgeable about one particular field, we are talking to my co-host and sister Michelle today about the 5 things she learned in sales. And let me tell you, as her sister, I have seen Michelle work in sales and it has really changed her. And it is really like interesting to see how it brings out these traits in her and just like how much more effective she can be as like a communicator or a deal maker than she was before. And it's taught me a lot of things. So I'm sure you guys will learn a lot today on the episode.
I hope so, Sammie. This is part 2 of our series. We did do one with Sammie about what she learned being a physician assistant. So check that out as well. But yeah, I agree, Sammie. I've been in sales for 6 years. I called alumni and worked at nonprofits 4 years before that. So I've been on the phone asking people for money for about 10 years, which is a third of my life. So that's kind of crazy to think about. But I totally agree. As somebody who I think innately is a people pleaser, non-confrontational, just overall probably didn't come into adulthood very equipped to have tough conversations. I think there are so many things I learned about just working in sales and having to have those conversations so often that I think are so applicable to people's day-to-day life.
So true, Michelle. I think, as a child, we're literally taught to be agreeable and non-confrontational and how to get along with people. We aren't necessarily taught how to come to agreements with people in an amicable way, but at the same time be firm. And I think sales has taught you that. And I think it's a skill that easily transfers over into real life.
Exactly, Sammie. Especially as a woman, especially in Asian culture, a lot of times those are the things that are emphasized. But I do think this is something that anybody in any space with any personality type, these are all things that people can work on. People often think, or even when I suggest sometimes that people consider sales as a career, they're like, oh, I'm not that aggressive. I'm not that good at talking to people. And it's interesting to me because those are not the things that I think are actually important when it comes to developing yourself as a salesperson. It's actually a lot of little things that anybody can make these changes to either be better in sales or to just have better, more productive conversations in your life. We talk about negotiating often. We have a whole episode on that we talk about. When you're asking for a promotion, when you're trying to have tough conversations with people at your work or people in your life. I think these are all really good things that I've been able to improve on because I've had to learn a lot of these different things in my sales career.
So let's hop to it. What's your first lesson, Michelle?
I would say the first thing and the most important thing when it comes to knowing about sales in general is it's really not about what you're pitching or how you say anything. It's really about the questions that you ask. Anytime you're having a conversation with somebody, the most important thing is you understand where they're coming from, what's important to them, what are their expectations, what does good or success look like. Like you need to understand all of these things first and foremost in having a conversation.
That's so true, Michelle. I see it even in medicine, when I'm asking my patients about something like quitting smoking. Like I could go on like a diatribe about all the things about smoking, but it's way more helpful for me to be like, when do you smoke your first cigarette? When's the next time you smoke? What are triggers for when you smoke? Who do you smoke with? Like actually figuring out like how this plays a role in their life. Are there other people? Are there social situations? Is it a time where they want to be alone? Like all those things, figuring that out and then trying to maintain that. Like, hey, like if that's your time of solitude, let's replace it with a tea and meditation. But if I just went on a rant about smoking, I'm not going to really be helpful to them in changing their life and improving their situation.
Exactly, Sammie. It's really about active listening because honestly, if something like sales was just telling as many people as possible the same pitch over and over again, it wouldn't really be that difficult. But I think anybody can point to a point in their life or a person they know that just went off on a diatribe or was lecturing them about something. And they have no idea where you're coming from. They're making a lot of assumptions. They're not really answering the concerns that you have. They're just wasting air at that point, trying to lecture you or force you into understanding their point.
That's a really great point, Michelle. A lot of us kind of know that we should be asking more questions or we forget about it, but we end up going on pedantic diatribes. Definitely, I'm guilty of that.
And I think the word diatribe 3 times in the last minute between the two of us. And we have a podcast. Obviously, we understand talking to people constantly without
without asking questions. And I think it's just really good to emphasize that.
Totally. It's funny now that I've been talking to different companies and consulting a little bit about how to do sales. A lot of times people are like, I don't want to be your sleazy salesman. I don't want to be just people have this picture of the used car salesman in their mind. And it's so funny because then I'm like, we'll talk about it. And I'll be like, ask questions. And I'll be like, okay, give me a pitch. Let me know what you got from that. Hit me with how you would approach somebody in this conversation. And they immediately go into this, oh, here's my product and this is what I can do for you. Da, 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 da. And I was like, no. I think we know we don't want to be that person, but we actually don't know what the alternative is. Mm-hmm. And the truth is that any good sales and any person who's been in the business long enough knows it's really about asking questions, because at the end of the day, you want to figure out if this is the right person to be talking to, if they even need your product. You don't want to be going on and on and on and you realize this person is totally irrelevant and you're just wasting both of your time.
That's a really good point, Michelle. I think a lot of times people start talking because they don't want to waste the other person's time. And they're like, let me just get out what the product is so they know. Mm-hmm. And you make a really good point that you should ask questions, and people love to talk about themselves. So people would much rather answer your questions or speak than listen to you speak.
100%. Honestly, if you just struggle with making friends, this is also a great tip. Just ask a lot of questions and listen and respond and have an engaging conversation, and you'll convert people into your friend as well.
So what's lesson number 2, Michelle?
I would say my biggest lesson in sales, Sammie, is don't be afraid to challenge people. And this is actually based off a popular sales book, The Challenger Sales. But when I read this book, it really changed how I approach my conversations with people. Part of that is because what they found in this book is that people who are successful at sales specifically are people who are willing to challenge their clients more than focus so much on like being kind and having a great relationship and all of these things. Like all those things are good. Like you shouldn't be an a-hole, but at the same time, you have to be able to give pushback and be able to process what people are telling you and be able to point out like the flaws in their thought process.
Okay, so this is a little tricky one for me to understand because when I think of challenging people, I'm like, let's set a goal that's like a little bit outside of your easy goals. So when you're having a conversation with someone about something like trying to sell them a product, like what does challenging them look like?
Oh, that's a really good point, Sammie. I should say that challenging somebody is not challenging them to meet a goal. Challenging them is to point out something that's inconsistent or not true with what they're saying. So an example of that would be if you told me, oh, Michelle, I've decided that I am going to work on myself and meditate every single day. And I would say, that's really interesting, Sammie. At the beginning of this conversation, though, that you said that you wanted to hire someone to help you with that. The difference is that instead of saying, oh, that's great, I'm happy to hear that, I'm saying that this is something you're telling me that goes against what you said before. Essentially, you're pointing out that this person is being inconsistent.
Now that I know about this, I realize that you do this to me all the time. I'm constantly being challenged and manipulated by Michelle. Imagine living with her.
I will say when I first learned this concept, I started to practice on my friends and my Uber drivers, because this is when I was taking like 5 Ubers a day. And they definitely got frustrated because if you really push it too far with people and you're just constantly like, well, that's interesting because you just said this. And oh, I thought you meant this because you told me this. People do get annoyed very quickly. But it is a good thing to practice because honestly, it's the difference between, I read this term recently for therapy that's like idiot compassion, which I do all the time with my friends, which is basically like, you're right, you're perfect, that person sucks, versus actually challenging them a little bit and be like, okay, I'm going to push back and get a sense of what you're saying. And the reason this is important, this is one of my favorite Tim Ferriss quotes from, I believe, 4 Hour Workweek. He says that a person's success in life can usually be measured by the number of uncomfortable conversations he or she is willing to have. And what you see in something like sales, or anytime you're talking to someone, if you're talking to customer service, if you're talking to anybody really, what happens is that we want this person to like us. We want to please them. And so we don't want to ask the uncomfortable questions. We don't want to give pushback, even though sometimes we know in our head what they're telling us isn't adding up. And sometimes we don't even know what we want. So it helps to challenge someone so they can think through what they're talking to you about and they can sort out what's actually important. And you both can learn what is most important to those people.
Very interesting. I'll be using that one on you soon. So what's the next thing you learned?
I would say the third thing I learned was it's very important to set expectations and it's very important to get everything in writing. When I started in sales, I, for the first 6 months, worked with the worst clientele. Like, it's difficult to fully go into why these people were terrible to sell to, but essentially they were always looking for a deal. They would 100% renege on whatever they told you. They were not necessarily bad people. Some of them were the worst people I've ever worked with. But in general, they just knew that they could get a deal if they could catch you slipping up. And so that's when I learned you have to set expectations with people and you need to learn what their expectations are. So I would say, okay, what's your goal? What would success look like at the end of the month? And then I would type it up in an email and I would send it to them. And then they would, in a month, come back and say, this didn't work. And I would say, well, you said if we got 5, it would work. And you got 6. And they're like, well, fine. That's just so important in anything that you do. Whether you want a promotion at work, it's good to know what your boss's expectations for you are and to get everything in writing because it works both ways. If you ask for a promotion, it's good to know, hey, you said if I do X, Y, Z, I can get a promotion. I did X, Y, Z. What am I missing? And so set expectations. Don't be afraid to ask, like, what do you actually want from me? And it's also great if you can get it in writing too.
Wow. That's a really good one. And I need to work on this one because I was just thinking about me emailing my workplace about our internet being slow. And they had responded like, oh, you know what? We're actually working on it and we'll actually be fixing it soon. And I was like, awesome, thanks. And I really should have said something like, awesome, thanks. Like, what date do you expect this to be done by? Or something like that, where I was setting a clear boundary of when I could check back in and be like, is it fixed yet or what happened?
Oh, yeah, this is a very common mistake in sales. So much so that my last sales trainer always used to say, no date, no deal. Because the thing is that everybody wants to be agreeable when they're talking to you. And so a lot of times people will just be like, oh, yeah, I love that idea. I love this product. It's so amazing. I could totally see how it would work for us. And you get off the call and you're like, amazing. This person is totally going to buy. And the next thing you know, you're like calling them. You don't hear from them. You don't really know like what's going on. And instead, if you're like, amazing, I'm glad you love it. When should we get started? Next week? Friday? If I don't hear from you from Friday, should I be concerned? And then all of a sudden it's like, well, actually, my boss is on vacation for the next 2 months. And actually, we have this initiative and we're doing this and we're doing that. And you really start to see that they were just trying to appease you. They had actually no intention of following through. Or maybe they do have intention of following through, in which case they can put a date on it.
This actually also reminds me of actual dating, where like if there's no date, there's no deal. Like
Amen,
you match
girl.
with somebody on an app and you're talking to them, they're like, you're so pretty, you're like, you're so funny, ha ha ha. And then like, if I don't see them like trying to make a literal date for us to hang out, or at least a call or something like that, then I'm just kind of like, you know what? I'm not going to just be like chatting with someone like we're pen pals and just like wasting my time with that, because truthfully, I don't have time. So one thing I really care about is people who are diligent and organized and punctual and who respect my time. So yeah, no date, no deal.
Amen. Oh my gosh.
I like that. And there's so many people who like literally I've dated or ended up in relationships because they are so good at planning and making dates. Those people are like life's winners. So I personally need to be more like that.
Exactly. No date, no deal is going to be the title of my new dating app, where you have to make dates with people.
Ooh.
Great idea, guys. Don't steal it. Just kidding. Go ahead. It's so true. The amount of times, or even after a date, and we'll both be like, I had such a great date. Oh my gosh, this was so amazing. I had so much fun. Blah, 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 blah. And then you like never talk to each other again. And it's like, yeah, you can say whatever you want, but no date, no deal. Until that person has put something on the calendar and has showed up for it, it's not happening. And that's true for, I think, anything that's happening in your life. If you want something to happen, you got to put a date on it. You got to set expectations and you got to meet those expectations.
So funny. It's so true. And then I think about those people who are like you're out on the first day and you're like, yeah, I'd love to see you again. Love to see you again. And like, I'm kind of like, maybe I'd love to see you again. But then they're like, what about this Friday? And I'm like, okay. Those people, they do well for themselves. They close. They're closers. Okay, got it.
Yeah, or someone's like, what about Friday? And you're like, oh. You're like, I liked you, but now that I think about it, I never want to actually see you again. And I have to deal with this. Just kidding. It's almost always the opposite that happens.
So what's lesson number 4?
Oh, okay. So lesson number 4, which is weird transition after talking about dating, is never take a no from someone who can't say yes.
Tell me more.
So what this means is that in anything you do in life, but in the example of sales, is that you can talk to a million people. When I'm going after a company to work with, I might talk to the receptionist on the phone, and then an engineer at the company, and then this person and that person and whatever. And there are a lot of people on that list of people that I talk to that might tell me no. Like if I call the receptionist and they're like, no, he's not interested, they don't know. This person on the phone doesn't know what this person needs or wants. They're trying to protect this person's time. I understand that. But if you use that as like the dead end, you would be out of a lot of deals. And also, there's a lot of people who are afraid to take things up to their boss. There are people who don't know how to have those conversations with their bosses. So it's very important to know who the decision maker is and make sure that that is the person who tells you yes or no. Because until you hear it from them, you don't know if you got a deal or not.
This is a great point, because I think a lot of times we call people and we're like, hey, like, you know, I need a refund for this. And they're like, oh, sorry, we can't. And it's like, why not?
Like, you can't.
You can't. But maybe somebody can. And I think like in a polite way, being like, hey, that's okay, but can I talk to somebody else then who may be able to help me? I think that's a good point. And I remember even at my first job, as a mall concierge. That's right. Fancy word. And I was a fancy looking girl at that time.
Sammie, mall concierge.
A lot of times we would actually have protocols where it's like, at that time, people's big issue was that they couldn't get their money back for their gift cards. Like the gift cards would kind of expire and then the money would run out over time. And like, it's really unfair. But if they ask us, we're supposed to be like, hey, sorry, the policy is this. But then step 2, if they are persistent and they ask to speak with the manager, you're just supposed to let them. It's not supposed to be like you're having a brawl down at the concierge desk. You know, It's like, we're not defending the territory. And then they talk to the manager and they would get the bounce back. So it was just kind of like one of the steps in the protocol.
It's so true, Sammie. Sometimes when you're getting a new job and you're negotiating your contract, I think it's so important to make sure you're talking to your hiring manager, the person who has access to who's going to pay what. My example would be one time I was interviewing for a job and I spoke to the recruiter. They gave me the offer and I was like, this is great. Also, I wanted to ask about relocation. They didn't say anything about providing a relocation. No one had promised that to me, but I wanted to ask. And she told me, I don't know if we do that. I'll see. And I was like, all right, cool. If you can ask, that'd be great. And then when I spoke to my manager after she officially gave me the offer, I brought it up again. I said, hey, by the way, I was wondering about relocation because I know the recruiter is not hiring me. I know the recruiter does not gain anything if I get or don't get relocation. And so I asked my manager and she said the same thing. She was like, oh, I'm not sure, but I'll ask. And lo and behold, they gave it to me because eventually they talked to the right person. And that person, who I'm guessing was probably like our head of sales, was like, yeah, who cares? We'll throw it on as a sign-on bonus if that means we get to hire this person. So keep in mind that the person who is invested in having you at that company, the person who has access to the purse strings, those are the people that are important. If you're getting promoted and your manager is promising you all these things, but it's your senior manager who's making the decision, you need to keep those things in mind. You need to make sure you're talking to the right people and you're asking the right questions to the right people as well.
Really good point. I think about it in the reverse situation where like I might have a patient come in and talk to the front desk and all these other people and be like, hey, I need an appointment today. But then if they come ask me, like if my staff comes and asks like, hey, can this patient have an appointment? A lot of times I'm like, well, yeah, because like I don't want them waiting with that abscess or whatever's going on. And then like that's going to be a bigger problem for me later. So just let them in. So yeah, it makes sense. You kind of have to ask the right person. And it makes sense that people have guards in place so that they're not getting overwhelmed. But if it's really important to you, you really need to be talking to the right person.
Yeah. Gatekeepers are in place so that people who will turn away at the first no will turn away, which I think is appropriate in a lot of situations. And a lot of times you know how important something is to you if you're not willing to pursue it. But it's also really important to know, especially when you're having these type of conversations, that you're getting the right response from the right person.
And what is our last piece of advice?
So this last one is don't discount too early. I think this applies to if you're negotiating something and also if you are selling yourself or something that you own. Because what I see so often, and it literally drives me crazy, is when salespeople start to discount a product before they even have had a conversation, like in the conversation with the person. So they'll be like, so yeah, like this costs $100, but I can probably get you like a $50 discount. And then honestly, if you like, I go in, I talk to my boss, I can probably get an extra $10 off. It's like, this person may have bought it for $100 and they wouldn't have cared. Why the heck are you discounting it? You're making it seem like your product has no value, that you're just assigning a random price to it. And the more you discount it, the more you actually cut yourself at your knees because you're basically saying, this is just a BS price. This isn't what it's actually worth. And I just think it's such a terrible habit. But I see people do that even when they're doing their own negotiations. You know, I'll talk to somebody and they'll be like, I want to make $200K on my next salary. And you're like, amazing. And they're like, yeah, I talked to them. And I was like, I would like to make 190 or maybe even 170. Or you know what? Honestly, I would do it for 50K. And you're like, why the heck did you tell them that? Now they're going to know that you'll do it for 50K. They're never going to pay you more for it. So I think it's really, really, really important. Whatever number you put out there, whatever you are selling, like let that person think about it first. Don't start discounting it early.
So true, Michelle. And you have taught me this multiple times. And definitely with salary negotiations, you have been super helpful with this, where you're like, don't even mess around. You've got nothing to lose. Like, stick to your guns, stick to the number that you want. Then I'm like, okay, feels like a lot, but I'm going to do it, And yeah, whether it works out or not, last thing you want to do is get yourself in a position where like you've already mentally lowered the bar for them.
Mm-hmm. You're negotiating with yourself. You're like a crazy person. You're like, I'll do it for 200,000. I'll do it for 150. I'll do it for 60,000. You're like, a person just sitting there silent next to you. Like, okay, like, what should I take back then? And so, yeah, I think that's really important. Everybody does it. I hear everybody do it. That's why I'm always like, do not, like, as soon as you say it, like, shut up. Because you just need to let them process the information that you gave them. And also, this might be with a specific number, or it could just be with general qualities, like soft skills or something. Because people will also be like, I mean, I know I don't have like the master's degree that you guys asked for, and I don't have the 6 years of experience, or I don't have this, or I don't have that. And you're like, Jesus, like, are you trying to convince them to pay you more? Or are you trying to make them regret their decision? You don't need to point out the negatives. If you did your job right, you asked a lot of questions, you understood their expectations at the beginning, and ideally you got it in writing, you pushed back where you saw any sort of inconsistency, and now you're at a point where you're negotiating and you can say, hey, this is where we got to. This is why I think I'm worth this much, or this product I'm selling you, or this cup I'm selling you is worth this much. I'm going to stand by it. And if they want to negotiate from there, they can, but don't discount yourself too early.
So, takeaways for this episode, Michelle. Let's see if I got them. First, it's all about the questions that you ask. Pretty much shut your trap and ask questions, listen with your ears, and don't go blabbing, which is a big lesson that I could definitely take myself.
Always.
2, don't be afraid to challenge people. And that doesn't mean like an arm wrestling challenge. That means if you hear fallacies or inconsistencies in their logic when they speak, don't hesitate to point it out. Don't just be really nice and go along with what they say. Point out where they're off the mark.
Yeah, Sammie.
And the third point, set expectations and get everything in writing. Don't just agree and assume that that's the end of it. Make sure that these people have documented that they are going to follow through with what they agreed to, and set dates for things, including real dates. Be a closer. Be the person who plans the next visit so that you can get what you want.
Exactly. No date, no deal. And worst case, you'll learn something about what their actual timeline and what their actual thought process looks like.
That's a good point. I think a lot of times we don't get it in writing, or we don't set the date because we're kind of afraid that they don't actually want to do that. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to like come up with that reality that we kind of like want to live in that glow that like they are going to fix the internet. And it's like, no, you need the timeline for like when that's actually going to happen.
Yeah. And a lot of times it also gives that person space to not be harassed by you, right? Like if you know they're going to get back to you by Friday, you're not going to call them Monday through Thursday.
So true. Your fourth recommendation, never take no from someone who can't say yes. Mm-hmm. And lastly, don't discount too early. Let the other person tell you if they got an issue. You don't need to be hedging and reducing things and trying to accommodate them before they even indicated whether it works for them or not.
Exactly. You get what you ask for in this world. And if you ask for less, you're going to get less.
Wow, Michelle. I have been majorly enlightened by what you shared with me. And now I understand why I'm always losing in all arguments or plans or deals that we try to come up with, because it's like, there's really no hope for me when you have all these skills.
No, Sam, that's not true. You're very good, and you win a lot of arguments, mostly because you're really good at writing things down.
That's the one skill I have.
Somebody can set proper expectations. It's Sammie.
But I'm going to work on these other ones so that I can be just as good at all the other parts of deal making.
Yeah, exactly. And I hope these life lessons were helpful for our listeners. I really think they can be applicable to so many different parts of your life. And in my mind, it's really just about having tough conversations without having to turn into this crazy, aggressive, person who feels like they have to like shake people to get them to listen to you. A lot of times this is just different ways to have a good conversation and to make sure that everybody is on the same page.
Truth, Michelle.
Let us know if you found any of them helpful, if there's anything you would share. If you have any questions, let us know. A few people have reached out to me after our negotiations episode. I love helping people with that kind of stuff, so definitely don't hesitate to reach out.
And most importantly, be sure to join us next time as we put down the rule book and rethink the status quo.